It happened in the middle of a busy workday, right in front of everyone. The office was alive with the sounds of ringing phones, hurried footsteps, and the quiet murmur of employees typing away at their desks. But all of that faded into silence when she was called into the manager's office. She had known this moment was coming. The subtle digs, the way her ideas were dismissed in meetings, the cold glances from the higher-ups, it had all been leading to this. Still, she hadn't expected it to happen so publicly. The manager, a man known for his condescending tone and sharp tongue, stood with his arms crossed. His voice carried over the room, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "You don't belong here," he said flatly, shaking his head. "I've given you chance after chance, but you're just not cut out for this level of work." She could feel the stares of her co-workers. Some looked away, pretending to be busy. Others stole quick glances, their eyes flickering with a mix of pity and discomfort. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let her face betray her emotions. "I don't understand," she said, keeping her voice steady. "My work has been solid, and I've met all my deadlines," the manager scoffed. "Your work?" He picked up a stack of papers from his desk, shaking them in the air. "I had to redo this entire report. Do you have any idea how much time you've wasted?" She knew that was a lie. She had stayed late for 3 nights working on that report, ensuring every detail was perfect. But she also knew arguing wouldn't change anything. This wasn't about her work. This was about him. He had never liked her. Never respected her. From the moment she was hired, he had made it clear he didn't think she deserved to be here. And now, he was making sure she was gone. "You're unprofessional, unreliable, and," he paused, a smirk curling at the edge of his lips. "Frankly, not a good fit for this company." She understood the real meaning behind those words. Her fists clenched at her sides. She wanted to fight back, to call him out in front of everyone. But deep down, she knew the battle was already lost. With one final shake of his head, he slid a termination notice across his desk. "Clean out your desk. You're done here." A long silence settled in the room. Even the air felt heavier. Slowly, she reached for the paper, her fingers tightening around it. Her mind raced through all the long nights she had spent proving herself, the sacrifices, the extra effort, none of it had mattered. She turned, walking toward her desk. The sound of her own footsteps echoed in her ears. As she packed her things, she could feel the eyes on her, some filled with guilt, others with indifference. No one spoke up for her. No one dared. She slung her bag over her shoulder, lifted her chin, and walked toward the exit. But just as she reached the door, she stopped. Slowly, she turned back. The manager was already watching, his smug expression still in place, as if daring her to say something. Instead, she smiled. Not a forced, bitter smile. But a real one. A smile that said, "You think you've won. But you have no idea what's coming." "I'll see you around," she said simply. Then, without another word, she walked out of the building. And in that moment, she made a vow, one day, she'd be back. But next time, it wouldn't be as an employee. It would be as the boss. She stepped out of the glass doors of the office building, feeling the sharp sting of cold air against her skin. But the chill was nothing compared to the fire burning inside her. This wasn't just a job loss, it was humiliation. She had worked late nights, skipped lunch breaks, put in twice the effort, and still, it wasn't enough. Or rather, it had never been meant to be enough. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag as she walked away, her mind racing. She had no job, no backup plan, and her savings wouldn't last long. But even as uncertainty pressed in on her, she refused to let despair take over. She wouldn't crumble. Not for him. Not for anyone. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. She didn't have time to wallow in self-pity. If she was going to make a comeback, she had to start now. With a few swipes, she started searching. Jobs, business courses, networking events, anything that would get her back on her feet. She had always dreamed of going further, of becoming more than just another office worker lost in a sea of cubicles. But life had gotten in the way. She had bills to pay, responsibilities, and fear of failing, of taking risks, of not being enough. Not anymore. The job market was brutal. Rejection after rejection came, and each one felt like a slap in the face. She had the experience but not the title. And without the title, doors stayed shut. That's when she realized, she couldn't just find another job. She had to change the game completely. Her mornings were no longer about getting up for work. Instead, they were about reinventing herself. She enrolled in an online business course, using what little money she had left. She devoured every lesson, studied market trends, and learned the ins and outs of corporate structure. The more she learned, the more she saw through the system, how talent was overlooked, how bias shaped promotions, and how people like her were often pushed aside despite their skills. She refused to be a statistic. She refused to be forgotten. At night, she networked. She attended virtual seminars, joined professional groups, and spoke up in industry discussions. And then, one day, a chance encounter changed everything. It happened at a networking event. She had been listening to a panel of CEOs discuss leadership when a man sitting next to her struck up a conversation. "Interesting discussion," he said, nodding toward the speakers. "But it's always the same faces talking about leadership, isn't it?" She smirked. "And yet half the best leaders never get a seat at that table." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You sound like someone with a story." She hesitated, then decided to tell him, all of it. The wrongful termination. The condescending remarks. The way she had been discarded like she didn't matter. When she finished, the man leaned back in his chair, watching her closely. Then he smiled. "Most people would have taken that hit and stayed down," he said. "But you? You're building yourself back up." There was something about the way he said it, like he knew the struggle personally. Then, he handed her a business card. "You should call me. I know people who'd love to work with someone like you." She glanced down at the card. A well-known business consulting firm. A real opportunity. She looked back at him, her heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. This wasn't just about getting another job. This was about making a move, one that would change everything. She stared at the business card in her hand. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of her future. Was this her breakthrough moment? The man, whose name was listed as Mr. Calloway, had given her an opportunity. But was it real? Or was it just polite conversation, something he'd forget the moment he walked out of that conference? She took a breath. No more doubting. No more hesitating. That night, she sent an email. A concise, professional message, one that highlighted her skills and expressed her interest in working with his firm. She didn't expect an immediate response. But the next morning, her inbox had a surprise. "Call me today. Let's talk." Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the phone. The call lasted nearly an hour. Mr. Calloway asked about her background, her experience, her vision. She could tell he wasn't interested in rehearsed answers. He wanted to know how she thought, how she handled pressure, what drove her. By the time they hung up, she had an invitation. "Come by the office Monday morning. Let's see what you can do." Excitement warred with doubt. She was stepping into a high-level firm, competing with people who had Ivy League degrees and powerful connections. And yet, she wasn't scared. She was ready. Monday morning, she walked into the sleek, glass-walled office building. It was a world away from where she had been, a place of power and influence. As she sat in the waiting area, she overheard two employees talking. "They're bringing in someone new for the expansion project." "Another exec?" "No, an advisor. Someone with a different perspective." Her stomach tightened. Was that her? Moments later, she was ushered into a conference room where Mr. Calloway and 3 other executives sat waiting. "This isn't an interview," he said, leaning forward. "This is a test." He slid a thick folder across the table. "Review the details. If you were leading this project, what would be your first move?" She opened the folder, her mind kicking into overdrive. The project involved restructuring an underperforming branch. The numbers were bad, morale was worse, and leadership was clearly failing. She skimmed the reports, analyzing patterns. It didn't take long to see the real problem. "This isn't a performance issue," she said, looking up. "This is a leadership issue." One of the executives raised an eyebrow. "Explain." She pointed to the employee retention rate. "The turnover rate is highest among mid-level employees, the people who actually run the day-to-day operations. That means they're not leaving because of money. They're leaving because they're being undervalued." Another executive nodded slowly, intrigued. "And your solution?" She didn't hesitate. "Before cutting costs or restructuring departments, you fix the leadership. You promote from within, reward innovation, and create a system where employees feel invested. Because if you don't, you'll just keep bleeding talent." A silence settled over the room. Then Mr. Calloway smiled. "Interesting take." He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "I think we just found our new advisor." Her breath caught. She had done it. Not just another job, this was a seat at the table. And the best part? The branch she'd just been assigned to? It was the same company that had fired her. She walked through the doors of the very same building she had left in disgrace. Only this time, she wasn't an employee. She wasn't here to take orders, to be dismissed, to be treated as less than. This time, she was in charge. Dressed in a sleek blazer, portfolio in hand, she stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking against the marble floor. The receptionist looked up and gave her a polite, professional smile, the same kind of smile that, months ago, had barely concealed pity. Now, there was something different in that gaze. Recognition. Maybe even respect. She was here as an advisor, overseeing the company's restructuring. And her first order of business? Evaluating leadership. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She knew who she would be facing soon. Him. Her former manager. The man who had humiliated her, accused her of incompetence, and discarded her like she didn't matter. Now, his job was on the line. And he had no idea she was the one holding the pen that could rewrite his fate. She was led into the conference room, where a group of managers sat, waiting for the corporate advisor they had been warned about. They looked tired, uneasy. They knew something was changing, but they didn't know what. And then she stepped in. The shift in the air was instantaneous. Some of them blinked, recognizing her immediately. Others whispered among themselves. A few simply stared, unable to mask their shock. But he, the manager, hadn't turned around yet. He was flipping through a folder, distracted. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady. The manager froze. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked at her. And in that moment, she saw it, the flicker of panic behind his eyes. She watched as he processed what was happening, the reality crashing down on him. She was no longer the employee he had dismissed. She was someone who could change his entire future. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in an awkward attempt to regain control, he forced a chuckle. "Well, look at you," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "You've certainly moved up in the world." She tilted her head, studying him. He was nervous. Good. Because now, he would have to sit and listen, just like she had to listen to him that day in his office. She placed her portfolio on the table and looked at the group. "As you all know, the company has brought me in to assess leadership effectiveness," she began. "My job is to identify areas for improvement and make recommendations for the restructuring process." The manager shifted in his seat. "Well, I can assure you, we've been running things efficiently here. We don't have leadership problems." She raised an eyebrow. "Then why is employee retention at an all-time low?" she asked. Silence. "Why are teams struggling with productivity?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "I've reviewed the numbers," she continued. "And from what I've seen, this isn't a company-wide issue. It's a management issue." The other managers exchanged wary glances. She let the words settle before delivering the final blow. "And that starts with who's leading these teams." Her former manager was no longer smirking. He was sweating. She could tell he wanted to argue, to throw excuses, to shift the blame. But he couldn't. Because now, the power was in her hands. And for the first time in his career, he was the one who had to prove his worth. The silence in the room stretched. Her former manager, the man who had fired her without a second thought, sat stiffly across the table. His confidence, once so unshakable, was now crumbling. She watched him for a long moment, letting him feel the weight of what was happening. Then she turned to the rest of the room. "I'm here to make sure this company succeeds," she said, her tone measured but firm. "And to do that, we need to address the biggest problem, how leadership has been failing the employees." A murmur spread across the table. Some of the other managers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. But she noticed something else, too. Some of them looked hopeful. She had spent the past week reviewing reports, reading through exit interviews, and listening to the people who actually worked under these managers. And the truth was clear. Her former manager wasn't the only problem. He was just the loudest one. He finally cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "I don't think it's fair to blame management for everything," he said, his voice tight. "We've been running things the way we always have. Employees come and go, it's part of business." She narrowed her eyes. "That's exactly the problem," she said. "You've been running things the way you always have. And that's why you're failing." His jaw clenched. Before he could argue, she slid a report across the table. "These are the resignations from the last year alone," she said. "Notice anything?" He glanced down at the paper, but she knew he wouldn't need to read far. The evidence was overwhelming. Most of the employees who had quit had one thing in common: they had worked directly under him. The other managers leaned in, reading the document. One of them, a middle-aged woman with glasses, shook her head. "This is worse than I thought," she muttered. She turned to look at the others. "How did we let it get to this point?" For the first time, her former manager had no answer. She leaned back in her chair, giving them a moment to absorb the truth. Then she spoke again. "I'm not here to fire anyone," she said. "Not yet." Her former manager's head snapped up at that. "Not yet?" "I believe in second chances," she continued. "I believe people can change, if they're willing to." She folded her hands on the table, looking directly at him. "You have a choice," she said. "Either you start earning your position, or we find someone who will." The room was so quiet, she could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Her former manager swallowed hard. She could see the battle in his expression, his pride versus reality. She wasn't demanding his resignation. She was demanding something harder. Growth. Accountability. Acknowledgement. And for a man like him, that was far worse than just being let go. The meeting wrapped up soon after. As the managers filed out, she remained seated, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. Her former manager hesitated before standing. For the first time, he didn't look smug. He looked uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you again," he admitted quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "I did." He let out a slow breath. "I was wrong about you," he muttered. "I see that now." She studied him carefully. "Then prove it," she said simply. With that, she gathered her files and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, with the weight of his own choices pressing down on him. She stepped out of the conference room, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. The meeting had gone exactly as she intended, direct, undeniable, and strategic. She hadn't come for revenge. She had come to change things. But the real question remained. Would he change? Her former manager had built his career on arrogance, on dismissing those he thought beneath him. Now, he had to answer for it. And if he thought he could get away with pretending to change, while keeping his old ways intact, he was wrong. Because this time, she was watching. The next few weeks were tense. She wasn't the only one assessing him, upper management had begun paying attention too. The whispers in the hallways, the nervous energy in the meetings, it was clear that change was coming, whether people liked it or not. At first, he tried to act like nothing had changed. He carried himself with the same stiff arrogance, making it clear that he resented the power shift. But his actions spoke louder than his pride. For the first time, he was showing up to team meetings prepared. He wasn't barking orders anymore, he was listening. She noticed small things. How he hesitated before dismissing an idea. How he tried, awkwardly, to ask for input instead of shutting it down. It was clear that he was trying, but was it out of genuine change? Or was he just trying to save himself? One afternoon, she decided to push him further. She called a meeting with him and 2 senior employees from his department. Employees who had worked under him for years, and who had suffered the most under his leadership. They sat stiffly in their chairs, eyes cautious. They knew how this usually went. He would talk. They would listen. Nothing would change. But she wasn't going to let that happen. She looked at her former manager. "You've worked with these 2 for years," she said. "What do you think they'd say about your leadership?" He blinked, caught off guard. "Well, he stopped, glancing at them. "I think we've had our challenges." One of the employees, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, snorted. She didn't say a word. She just waited. Finally, her former manager sighed. "All right," he muttered. "I know I haven't always been approachable." That was an understatement. "But I've been making an effort," he continued. "And I know I have more to work on." She looked at the employees. "Do you agree?" she asked. There was a long silence. Then, one of them, a woman who had been overlooked for promotions under his leadership, spoke. "I think you're trying," she admitted. "But we're waiting to see if it lasts." Her former manager nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. For the first time, he wasn't making excuses. She leaned back in her chair, watching him closely. This was his moment of truth. Would he commit to this change? Or would he fall back into old habits? That night, she sat in her office, staring at her notes. She had expected resistance. She had expected excuses. But what she hadn't expected was a flicker of something real in his eyes. Regret? Embarrassment? Maybe even growth? She sighed, rubbing her temples. Somewhere deep inside, she had wanted him to fail. Because it would have been easier. Easier to let him be the villain. Easier to justify removing him. But life wasn't always simple. And maybe, just maybe, people could change. She sat in her office, fingers drumming lightly against her desk. The reports were in front of her, the numbers clear. Something was shifting. For the first time in years, employee morale was rising in her former department. Complaints about leadership had decreased. Productivity was up. But she wasn't convinced yet. Numbers could be manipulated. Behavior could be temporary. She needed to see it with her own eyes. And so, she decided to test him. The following Monday, she arrived at the office early, blending in with the regular employees. She took the long route through the cubicles, listening. The atmosphere was different. People weren't working in tense silence anymore. Conversations flowed naturally. Laughter floated through the air. This wasn't the same place she had left. And then, she spotted him. Her former manager stood in the middle of a small group, not barking orders, not looming over employees like an overseer, but actually listening. She watched as one of the junior analysts explained a process improvement idea. He nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. Let's try it for a week and see the results. She raised an eyebrow. Who was this man? The old version of him wouldn't have entertained any input from his team. He would have dismissed the idea outright, insisting his way was best. Yet here he was, giving them a voice. He turned slightly, and for a moment, their eyes met across the room. He froze. She saw the flicker of something in his expression, surprise, embarrassment, maybe even a hint of pride. She didn't look away. Neither did he. Then, in a move that shocked her, he gave a small nod. A silent acknowledgement. She inclined her head slightly in return before walking away. For the first time, she considered the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was truly changing. The real test came later that afternoon. She scheduled a one-on-one meeting with him. Not as his boss, not as someone who held power over him, but as a neutral observer. He entered her office, more composed than the last time they sat across from each other. She folded her hands on the desk. Tell me, honestly. Why now? He exhaled, leaning forward slightly. Because I was comfortable, he admitted. I had authority. No one challenged me. And when you're in that position for too long, you stop questioning yourself. He let out a small, dry chuckle. And then you came back. And suddenly, I had to answer for everything. She raised an eyebrow. And? He looked down at his hands for a moment, then back up at her. I didn't like what I saw. That admission struck her more than anything else. Not an excuse. Not blame. Just accountability. People respected me because they had to, he continued. Not because they wanted to. That's a hard thing to face. She watched him carefully. Could it be that simple? That all it took was being forced to confront his own reflection? Or was this just another performance to stay in power? She wasn't sure. But she did know one thing. The man sitting across from her was not the same man who had fired her in front of an entire office. As the weeks passed, she continued to observe. She saw him pull struggling employees aside, not to reprimand them, but to ask how he could help. She saw him admit when he didn't have all the answers. She saw genuine effort. And while the old wounds he left behind couldn't be erased overnight, she saw something she never expected. Redemption. But the real question remained. Would she let him stay? Or would she decide that some past actions could never truly be undone? She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, arms crossed, staring down at the city below. A year ago, she had walked out of this building humiliated and powerless. Now, she held all the power. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her former manager, once so smug, so untouchable, was now under her judgment. Every decision she made about him would ripple through the company, affecting not just his future but the entire team that had worked under him. And yet, this wasn't easy. Firing him would be simple. Clean. The ultimate poetic justice. But was that really what she wanted? Or was there something more powerful than revenge? That afternoon, she called for a final meeting. He walked into her office, his usual confidence replaced with something else. Something that almost resembled humility. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit." He obeyed without a word. She folded her hands on the desk. "Let's be direct. You know your position in this company isn't secure." He nodded. "I do. I have two choices," she continued. "I can fire you today, right now. And no one would question it." She let those words settle. He didn't flinch. Didn't argue. He simply waited. She leaned forward slightly. "Or I can let you prove to me that you've changed. That you're not just putting on a performance because you want to keep your job." His brows furrowed, as if surprised by the option. "I won't lie to you," he said after a long pause. "At first, I did it to survive. I thought if I just played along, I could wait out the storm." She wasn't surprised. "And now?" He exhaled. "Now, I see what I was too blind to see before." He shook his head. "I thought I had to be ruthless to get ahead. That power meant control. That making people fear me meant they'd respect me." He looked up at her then. "But I was wrong." She studied his expression, looking for insincerity, for any sign that this was just another performance. But there was none. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, she saw something that had never been there before. Accountability. She leaned back in her chair, considering him. "I've seen men like you before," she said quietly. "They rise through the ranks, stepping on people they don't think matter. And when they finally fall, they expect someone to pull them back up." She let her words hang in the air. "I'm not here to save you," she said finally. "Your career? Your reputation? That's on you." He nodded slowly. "But," she continued, her voice steady, "if you're serious about change, then prove it. Not to me. To them." She gestured towards the office floor, where his team worked. "The people you dismissed. The people you pushed aside. Earn their trust back." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Give me the chance to," he said quietly. She let out a slow breath, tapping her fingers against the desk. Then, finally, she nodded. "This is your last chance," she said. "Don't waste it." When he left her office, she remained seated, staring at the door. Had she made the right decision? She wasn't sure. But she did know this: some victories weren't about revenge. Some were about redemption. And sometimes, the greatest punishment wasn't being cut down, it was being forced to rise the right way. She sat at the head of the conference table, watching the team members file in. The air was charged, thick with anticipation. Today would be the final test. The restructuring process was complete. The company had shifted, new systems had been put in place, and employees were thriving under better leadership. But the real question remained: what about him? Her former manager sat at the far end of the table, straight-backed, his hands folded on the surface in front of him. He was still here. Still standing. But had he truly changed? Or had she made a mistake by giving him a second chance? She intended to find out. The meeting began. Each department head gave updates, discussing progress, growth, and areas for improvement. Then, it was his turn. She didn't speak. She simply watched as he stood, cleared his throat, and looked around the room. And then, in a move that stunned everyone, he did something unthinkable. He apologized. Not just a vague, blanket statement. A real, raw, specific apology. I know I wasn't the leader I should have been, he admitted. His voice was steady, but there was weight behind his words. For years, I focused on control instead of collaboration. I pushed people down instead of pulling them up. A few employees exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to react. But he wasn't finished. I made mistakes, he continued. And those mistakes cost this company good people. They cost trust. And trust is a lot harder to rebuild than a quarterly report. Silence settled over the room. He looked directly at her then, and she saw it. Not fear. Not desperation. Ownership. She let the silence stretch before finally speaking. Words are powerful, she said. But actions are stronger. What have you done to make this right? He didn't flinch at the challenge. Instead, he reached into his folder and pulled out a document. These are my team's new retention numbers, he said, sliding it across the table. She picked it up, scanning the figures. Turnover had dropped. Productivity had increased. Employees who once dreaded coming to work were now reporting higher engagement. She looked back up at him. And what about the people who left because of you? His jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. I reached out to them, he admitted. Not to convince them to come back, but to own up to what I did. He sighed. Some accepted the apology. Some didn't. But that's not up to me. All I can do is prove I'm different now. She placed the document back on the table, considering him. This wasn't a man begging for forgiveness. This was a man earning it. After the meeting, employees trickled out, some still whispering about what had just happened. She lingered, waiting as he gathered his notes. Finally, she spoke. You could have walked away, she said. Found another job, started fresh somewhere else. Why stay and do the hard work? He met her gaze. Because I finally understand what leadership really is, he said. It's not about having power. It's about deserving it. A long pause stretched between them. Then, for the first time in their complicated history, she smiled. Then keep deserving it, she said. He nodded. I will. Months later, she sat at a different table, an executive roundtable, where real decisions were made. She had built something greater than she ever imagined. And as she looked back on the journey that had brought her here, she realized something important. The greatest revenge wasn't destruction. It was transformation. She hadn't just come back to take over. She had come back to change everything. And she had succeeded.